Well, hello, sexy listeners. I'm ThatPodcastGirl C Dub, and this is a podcast about house music. I want to start by saying hello to the new listeners I'm seeing pop up in Australia, Germany, the UK, Israel, and Brazil. I see some of you listening on your TV, streaming through Chromecast, sitting back and letting the sound fill the room. I love that. I'm really glad you're here. All season long, we've talked about rooms, Chicago basements, New York lofts, and UK warehouses. We've talked about sound systems, about pacing, about what happened when clubs got bigger and nights got longer, and house music had to stretch without losing itself. For this episode, I want to talk about the people and how they moved to this music. Because if you really want to understand a culture, you don't just listen to the music, you do have to watch what it does to people listening to it over time. House music dancing had a very particular feel to it. It had a posture, a way of settling into the body that showed up again and again, even though nobody was teaching it. It didn't come from choreography or instruction. It came from the conditions of the music itself. There were long blends, steady tempos. There was heat and sweat, and a lot of time. If you weren't around it, the dancing could look subtle, even understated. But once you recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere. In Chicago, for example, so much of the movement lived in the torso. The word jack shows up constantly in early house culture, in record titles, and in lyrics, in the way people talked about the music. Jackin described a rolling motion through the chest, ribs, and spine, a forward and back wave that never really stopped. The beat didn't hit the body from the outside. It moved through the center and outward. People didn't rush it. They let the motion repeat until it settled. Knees stayed bent. Weight dropped low into the hips. Nothing looked sharp or forced. Dancers talked about getting locked in, catching the groove, finding the pocket. Those weren't metaphors. They were describing what it felt like when the body finally lined up with the track. That made sense because Chicago house gave you time. Records stayed in place long enough for the body to relax into them. The dancing conserved energy, and it was sustainable. You could stay there for hours. When you move to New York, the quality shifts. The dancing becomes more contained, more internal. A lot of people later use the word lofting to describe it, connected to the culture of David Mancuso's loft and other non-commercial spaces where dancing wasn't about being seen. Movement stayed compact. Arms followed the body instead of leading it. Steps stayed close to the floor. People danced inches from each other without needing interaction. You could be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel like everyone was having a private experience. A lot of dancers from that era remember how quiet those floors could feel even when they were full. Not quiet in sound, but quiet in energy. It wasn't about big gestures or screaming. The movement stayed focused and inward. Across all these rooms, the feet carried the most information. House footwork was quick and responsive, but not flashy. Steps skimmed the floor. Heels and toes worked independently. Weight shifted constantly through small pivots, slides, and turns. Dancers responded to details in the music, hi-hats and shuffled percussion, swung claps, bass patterns that nudged the groove forward. Those patterns weren't taught. They were developed because the music rewarded attention. House tracks were repetitive, but they weren't empty. They were full of texture, and over time, the body learned how to listen with the feet. You could feel influences moving through the dance. Afrobeat rhythms, disco, Latin club movements, tap, not as named styles, but as muscle memory people already carried to the club. The social rules on the floor mattered just as much as the movement. People gave each other space. Circles formed when someone caught a movement, then dissolved without ceremony. If someone was deep in it, eyes closed, head down, soaked in sweat, that state was respected. There wasn't much clapping or interruption. Skill was recognized quietly. What mattered was stamina and presence, the ability to stay inside the groove without forcing it. What people wore followed the same logic. Sneakers mattered because you needed grip and flexibility for hours at a time. Pants were loose for movement and heat. Shirts got soaked and tied around waists, and towels showed up around necks because they were necessary. Layers came off and went back on as the room shifted. Over in New York, a friend of mine once described what felt like the most typical clubbing outfit of that era, and it's always stayed with me. Doc Martens, gearbaught jeans, a button-down shirt with a printed tie, a flight jacket, long hair, hoops in both ears, pirate style. In the UK, as acid house expanded into raves, the movement opened up. Bodies traveled across larger spaces, warehouses, fields, and industrial sites. It wasn't a floor anymore, it was the ground sometimes. Sometimes the floor wasn't even a room. It was wherever the sound system landed. The energy moved upward more often, so arms were lifted and people drifted, but the core stayed familiar. Repetition, endurance, and rhythm. The feeling that the night belonged to everyone who showed up. There are some raves that happen in fields, and the way that people dressed was more suitable for that kind of atmosphere. So you find yourselves with more boots and outerwear as the clothing of that era. House dancing looked the way it looked because house music was built the way it was built. Long mixes allowed the body to settle. Steady tempos supported stamina. Gradual transitions created space for attention instead of spectacle. The music didn't demand reaction, it invited commitment. Over time, dancers learned how to stay, how to listen longer than comfort, how to move without performing. That's why the dance took the shape it did. Not because someone taught it as a system, because the culture trained the body. Well, I want to be honest with you for a moment. This podcast started as a hobby almost 1 year ago on February 5th. I was dating someone who loved house music. He was a househead born in 1972. He grew up in Queens and Brooklyn. He dug through stacks of vinyl and told me about the 80s, the clubbing, when he was so young and so sexy. He told me about the 90s and the DJ rivalries, the neighborhood versus neighborhood beef, how certain records lined up with the rooms and certain beef moments. He showed me old black and white videos on YouTube, that Madonna club era, the footage, the posturing, and the movement. That's really what pulled me into this era of music. I'm really proud that in the span of 1 year, I built this podcast as my witness, a sexy little body of work made out of curiosity, respect, and love. I'm ThatPodcastGirl C Dub, and this is a podcast about house music. Thank you for staying with me. Until next time, keep the beats alive.